Mankind has developed many weapons, many things now, as we call them, weapons of mass destruction. We talk and debate sometimes about how wise or deadly we've become, and we talk about the various weapons, and we could even debate which is the greatest, the worst weapon there is. And we probably wouldn't think of the one I'm about to show you, but I think, at least from a spiritual point of view, the one I'm about to show you is probably the biggest weapon that Satan has ever had. Now, the TV would get second place, in my opinion, or nowadays we might have to say the internet. But when it comes to the mouth is one of the toughest things that there is to deal with, and that is probably the weapon of choice for most of us, is to talk in the mouth and to flap our yap, or however you happen to like to say it, in whatever terminology you prefer. It gets down to the mouth. And nowadays it's not always the phone. As we saw in the meeting, as Brother Deuster showed us, even Facebook, where you're not actually vocalizing words, but now we text words, we email words, we Facebook words, and so on and so forth. Even those, that's the same area, the same arena. And so it is that communications where we get ourselves in so much trouble. We're going to talk about this whole idea of the mouth, and we're going to not really look at anything brand new, but since we are those who are more sincere in the evening, and I don't really mean to insult anyone of the morning, but obviously when we have a crowd like we had this morning and we have only 70 this evening, while there are some valid reasons for folks being gone, let's face it, many are not here this evening simply because they're spiritually immature and have not developed to the level of really considering the things that we're going to talk about tonight. Not that they don't need to hear it, but you've heard the old saying, it goes in one ear and out the other. That will even be a challenge for us this evening at some level, because as you look at Matthew 12:36 and realize that every idle word we speak, we give an account of on the day of judgment, that's a little hard to grasp, isn't it? Every idle word. When you were watching the football game last night, if that was your thing, and the first quarter wasn't really going the way you wanted it to go, every idle word. Now, by the end of the game, if I understand right, you probably were a little more happy with it, and so your idle words were probably a little more positive in their connotation. When you're driving down the road, and we all know that there are other people who have a license that ought not to have them, and sometimes we mutter things under our breath, every idle word. When you're watching the news, and they're talking about politics, whichever side of the aisle you happen to be on there, every idle word that you speak. You're sitting around the table just having chit-chat. You're just talking about whatever. Every idle word we speak, we give an account of in the day of judgment. That's not to say that every idle word is wrong. We're just saying every word that comes out of our mouth, even the ones I'm speaking now, and I hope even through the end of the sermon, every one of those are acceptable to God. Everyone is still accountable to God. And should you lean over during the middle of the sermon and whisper something to your mate, which is fine, I'm not offended by that, we all do it from time to time, but every idle word that comes out of our mouth, and let me add, and I won't elaborate on this, every word we text, every word we Facebook, every word we email, we're accountable to God. And thus we try to get our discipleship to a level where we bring every thought into accountability, into captivity for Christ, and move forward in a way that pleases God. Ephesians 4:29, you're quite familiar with it, where he said, let no corrupt communication or corrupt word proceed out of your mouth. Now normally we would talk about, four-letter words and just the really obvious foul language. I think in our assembly tonight, we all understand that. We don't need to be talking about that kind of talk. I think we pretty much have that part under control. So we're going to focus more on some of the more subtle things. Now, I've got a whole list of them, and that's where we're going to be focusing the lesson. But the big stuff, we've got that one down. Well, hopefully you don't have a problem with the four-letter words and the swearing anymore. If you do, then you need to work on it, obviously. Ephesians 4:29 would address that. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to that point where we're able to bridle the whole body. He says we stumble in many things. If we don't stumble in word, we're perfect. He's not talking about absolutely perfect, never ever going to sin again. He's talking about mature. We're complete. We have finally reached that level of maturity that a Christian ought to strive for. And when you reach that level of maturity, that level of development that we aim for, you can bring the whole body into subjection, or as Paul would say, he disciplines his body and brings it into subjection. And so that's what we're aiming for, a Christianity where it's not just, as the world would call it, the obvious sins, but even every idle word comes under the scrutiny of our religious or spiritual understanding before it comes out of our mouth. And if we're really sharp, We can hold it back if it doesn't need to come out. Now, that's tough. That's one of the toughest aspects of Christianity. That's why I said that a lot of our morning crowd that's not here tonight wouldn't get this anyway, is because beyond the four-letter words that they know they ought not to say, when we start talking about this advanced discipleship, it is in one ear and out the other. It is just something that a lot of folks, I just don't think they begin to grasp it, even though intellectually it's not that tough of a thing to get intellectually. But it is a tough thing to implement and to actually grow up in, so that you start looking at your words before they're actually spoken. And that's where we're going to go. In Titus 2 and verse 8, he said, we want sound speech that cannot be condemned, that anyone who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. Again, got nothing new or profound to say here. This is just what I'm going to call advanced discipleship, advanced self-discipline, if you would. And we talk about restoring New Testament Christianity. And that is a marvelous, wonderful idea, because we're not supposed to add anything or take anything away. So that kind of necessarily implies the restoration of New Testament Christianity. So we got rid of the instrumental music, a good decision. We got rid of what we call institutionalism, good decision. We got rid of the social gospel, excellent decision. 1 Corinthians 11:34 would back us up on that. We have the Lord's Supper upon the first day of the week, just like the disciples did in the first century. We have done a lot of stuff right. But we can do all of that right. And I mean perfectly right, because I don't think we could have a complaint, one, about those practices as far as we are concerned here at this location. And yet if we don't follow on through and mature on up that higher level of self-discipline to where we bring the mouth into subjection, we can still lose it all, because we never learn to discipline the body, which includes the tongue, and bring it into subjection. Now, wouldn't that be a horrible thing? Think about that for a moment. You gave up all that. I'm not a big instrumental music fan anyway, but I'm going to say it this way. You gave up all that entertaining music. You gave up all that good apple pie and whatever else they were serving in the fellowship hall. You gave up nowadays the swimming pool and the basketball court and everything else they have in the family multi-life center. You gave up all the things that the religious world has to offer so you could practice New Testament Christianity and really get back to the basis of a book, chapter, and verse foundation. And you stand at the throne of judgment condemned because you never got it right here. Even though Matthew 12:36 was so obvious, we give an account for every idle word that proceeds out of our mouth. That's just really an overwhelming idea, isn't it? And so I want you to think about this in that advanced level instead of the four-letter words that we're not supposed to say level. And I want you to focus on yourself. I don't want you to think about your wife or your husband or your kid or somebody else, because, that's too easy to do. It is way too easy to look at somebody else and say, yeah, I heard them say the other day. And no, there's a time to do that, obviously. We need to help one another. But as Paul said, he could teach others and then he himself could be disqualified. So here again, what if we get everybody around us perfect in their speech, and yet we fail to gain that perfection ourselves? Now, what have we got? I don't want to sound cold or insensitive, but Philippians 2:12 does say, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. I do want to work out my salvation. Now, I want to help you work yours out too, and this is where I don't want to sound selfish, but the number one priority I'm working on here is me. And as I tease with my family, when I get me right, I'm coming after you, and they giggle because they know that ain't never going to happen, because I got a lot of work to do right here. There's no question about it. But I'm going to keep working on it and working on it. And so maybe someday I can help others. And speech is where we all stumble from time to time. This is the toughest area, even though I would call us the core of a congregation or Sunday night crowd or Wednesday night crowd. And I know some people are absent. They have a valid reason to be absent, so be cautious there. But even as sincere as we are, no mouth gets us all in trouble. What is corrupt speech? I'm going to start out with what it ought to be, just very briefly, and that's Colossians 4:6. Our speech ought to be that is seasoned with grace, seasoned with salt, that we know how to answer one another. Our speech ought to be that which edifies, builds up, encourages other people, supports them, nourishes them. Anytime our speech is tearing people down or in any way glorifying sin, that is corrupt speech. That's just pretty simple put there. Now, that doesn't mean you can't admonish somebody. There is a time that some people need a pretty stern admonition. That's fine. I've got no problem at all, and I don't see any inconsistency with the Bible when people might get tense, maybe a little red-faced, maybe a little heated at times. I have read where it said be angry and do not sin, but I have not read where intensity and anger in itself is inherently wrong. But you do have to be very careful when the tempers start to rise a little bit. But sometimes that is grace and seasoned with salt, because sometimes that is exactly what we need. And so we have our basis here is we want that language, or as Ephesians 4:29 would have said, edifies, builds people up. That's the basic thing that we're aiming for. We don't want speech that puts a stumbling block in front of other people. And this gets a little tricky sometimes because it's not all cut and dried, black and white, yes and no. And so you got to use a little judgment here at times and try to be aware of the situations that you're in. But sometimes, as we'll see in a minute, we can get into areas that drop stumbling blocks where we should have probably known better. But for whatever reason, we decided we would go ahead and say what we said. And this takes us to a level that says, hey, look, you drop a stumbling block in front of someone, cause an offense, it'd be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck to be thrown in the sea than to offend someone. I think about what Paul wrote over in Romans, I believe it was chapter 14, and leads on into chapter 15, about the food offending his brother, and if eating meat offends his brother, he'd never eat meat again. Well, if it's that way about meat, it's that way about speech also. And so there are times that we just intentionally avoid certain subjects with certain people. If you hang around a coffee shop, you know the illustration I'm getting ready to give you, because I've been there, and I know guys are just having fun, but sometimes it gets a little carried away. I've seen them look at somebody coming in and say, rib their buddy and say, watch this. And then they'll start into a politic thing, because they know where the political stance of the other one is. And for a certain time, it is just good old fun. But I've also seen it cross the line of fun, and people start to get upset, and people get into language they ought not to get into. And I'm talking about public cafes, so I'm not necessarily talking about our brethren here. And so people sometimes just for sport drop a stumbling block in front of others. Brethren, as Christians, we don't do that. We don't go that direction. We avoid it. Now, another area you have to be really careful in, and this is where sometimes we can do it, is we get to talking about things we just ought not to talk about. It's shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. There's a time and a place to talk about certain times and things. There's other places not to talk about it. And there are times where things can be discussed and they can't be discussed, and sometimes it's a judgment call. I have nothing against ladies sitting around talking about things that ladies might need to talk about, or men sitting around and talking about maybe some things that men need to talk about. But there are some things that just simply, in my opinion anyway, do not need to be discussed in mixed company, period. Husband and wife, maybe. Mixed company in general? No, not at all. There are some things that happen in this world that just simply do not need to be discussed. I'm not a big soap opera fan. And one of my things about soap operas would simply be, they're doing things in soap operas that we just don't need to be doing. We don't need to be participating in it. Now, if it's a shame to talk about those things, should I be being entertained by those things? And so I would take you back to Psalms 101 and verse 3 and say simply, I would set nothing wicked before my eye, and that would tie us back into speech also. And so we have some areas here that you really got to be careful about, because if you don't get them just right, you're going to get yourself in a whole lot of trouble. And Ephesians 5 and 12 is one of those areas that you have to look at. Now let's go to Ephesians chapter 5 and move back up a few verses. When that thing cools off, we'll turn it back on. Take it a minute. We blew the dust out of it here a while back, and we had good success for a while. About time to get up there and work on it again. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 3 and 4 is the next place that I want us to look at about, again, learning to purify our speech so that there's nothing inappropriate involved in it. He says, but fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints. Now, there's a comma there, if my glasses are looking right, maybe a semicolon, at the end of the word saints, which means this sentence goes on. He didn't stop. He says, now I don't want you to, fornication, don't even let that stuff be, that's bad. Don't let it be named among you. Neither, continue in the same sentence, filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. Now, this is probably going to leave us open to a little bit of an area of opinion. Where does one cross the line to foolish talking and coarse jesting? And some of us would recognize that line sooner than others. But the fact is, we have a very clear command here that foolish talking and coarse jesting are not to even be named among us. As Christians, one of the things we do is endeavor to put that kind of talking away. You see why I call this kind of advanced stuff? This is difficult stuff. Because this is where even I find myself, I love to get a laugh. I love to get a giggle. There's nothing like a good joke and people laughing around you. And you know how comedians get it? Usually a little off color. That's an easy way to get a joke, isn't it? And it's a temptation that we all have to deal with, especially if you got a little comedian in you. And so here you have to remind yourself, we're not going to go that direction. We're not going to foolish talking, coarse jesting. He said, don't do it. Now, again, I said, where's that line exactly? Well, you know, some of us are going to have different sensibilities about different things, and so we may not agree on it entirely. So the next best reference I can give you, and I don't have an overhead for it, and we're not going to turn to it here right in the moment, but it'll be 2 Timothy 2:22, where he said, flee youthful lust, pursue righteousness. You know what we tell a woman if she's asking, is this skirt too short? What do we say? If you got to ask, it probably is. Right now, why not take that same principle, and if you got to ask, is this line of humor okay? It probably isn't. You get the idea? I'm saying err on the side of caution. Be safe, because eternity is too important to give up for a good laugh or a good giggle, a good, chuckle around the coffee table. It's a lot of fun. But let me think. Good chuckle around the coffee table, eternal hell. Which one would, I think I'll try for heaven myself. I think that's the better place to go. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1. This one does not really come through as a verse on speech. But as we talk about perfecting holiness and being as pure as we can endeavor to be, this does come into play. Hebrews 2 and 1 says, therefore we must give the more earnest heed, lest the things which we have heard, lest we drift away. I'll get this out in a second. The things we have heard, lest we drift away. There are things that are said in society, and society is always changing. There are things that are accepted as commonplace now that generations in the past would have washed your mouth out with soap for. Now, I'm not about to give you illustrations. I had a preacher friend once did a whole bulletin of euphemisms and gave you the entire history of them. I thought that was inappropriate, and that was just a bulletin. I'm not about to stand up here and do it. But a euphemism is not necessarily an evil thing. When we use the phrase, so-and-so passed away, did you know that's a euphemism? That is a softer way of saying they died, because to say it that way is so blunt. Euphemisms are not all bad, but many of the euphemisms we use are bad. Much of the slang that is used is bad. And some of it is in that area that I can't really say, hey, that's outright wrong. But I want to be cautious with it, because just because something isn't overtly a sin, does that mean it's always a good thing? Paul said all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. You see, it's that old analogy of I can make a legal move, but it can still be an unwise move at times. And so getting into the language thing, my whole thing about euphemisms has always been, if I got to use toy keywords and I've got my mental thought process to arrange so that I plug in my toy words here and there, well, one of these days those toy words are going to be embarrassing. They're going to be kind of silly for an adult to be using toy curse words. And so now you either got to back off or plug in the real thing. And what's going to happen 9 times out of 10? People are going to plug in the real cuss word and simply drift away. So while the euphemism itself may not be a sin and may not cost you your soul, I'm saying it's not always a wise direction to go. And therein we need to be careful. We need to back off and look at it sometimes and say, am I really moving myself closer to God? Am I really moving myself in a heavenward direction and making myself stronger and fortifying my armor so that Satan has a tougher time with me? Or am I kind of loosening it up a little bit and giving me a little slack, maybe causing a few chinks here and there? You get the basic idea? And I think you do on that. Let's see if this thing can come back on. If it won't, we'll just continue the old-fashioned way. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Verse 11. Again, this is not a verse that you would really obviously connect with a speech sermon. But again, we're trying to move beyond the obvious to that level of greater self-discipline. And so when he says that you aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, to work with your own hands as we commanded, this is one of the things we're talking about. There are things that just aren't my business. There are things I may have an opinion about. There may be things that I want to talk about, but it's not my business. I don't need to be talking about it. I don't need to be carrying on and discussing it with other people. I need to simply be doing the things that I need to be doing for my life, not for somebody else's business and sticking my nose into places that it simply doesn't belong. And this becomes a problem because we all have a little bit of interest in what's going on around us. You know, the tabloids at the checkout stand, you know, while they're there, now you may not buy them, you know, they're usually so absurd, you know, President Obama's really an alien from Mars and nonsense like that. But the reason that stuff sells is because there is a market for it. Now, beyond the extreme absurdities of those kind of things, other people's lives do interest us. The life of the stars, you know, what the latest movie stars are doing and whatnot, and we get curious about that kind of thing. Folks, that's not my business. This is not, they may be public figures, that's fine, but you know, that's just simply not my business. Of course, I have another theory about that I'll share with you very quickly, is that when the people on TV are living their life and their dreams, and I'm just sitting back watching it, and all TV is not wrong, but I'm just a spectator. I want to be more than a spectator in life. I want to live life. Whatever my particular dream happens to be, I want to live that dream. For me, it was becoming a preacher and teaching the gospel and doing the things that I do. Whatever your dream happens to be, get off the couch and go live it. Yeah, a little TV, a little R&R, no problem. Watching the Hogs last night, since they won, that's really no problem. Little TV's all right, but too much TV, and you're wasting your life while other people are living theirs. Enough of that sermon. On to 5 and 13. There are folks that are gossips. They're busybodies. They're saying things they ought not to do. You know, that's wrong. That's sin. We get to talking about other people's business. That's all that is that just outright sin. And I know it's enticing. I know it's interesting. I know them juicy tidbits of gossip are fun to kick around, but it's still sin. And so we have to work at it. And we have to back off and look at ourselves. And we have to analyze from time to time. Should I have even said that? Should I have told that story, this story, or what have you? James 4:11, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother judges his brother. Now we'll balance that with James 7:24, judge righteous judgment. But you know, a lot of the judging that goes on is, you know, I don't know why they bought that car. They don't need that car. They didn't need that new house. They didn't need that this and that. And you know how people are. It is so easy to sit back and live somebody else's life and judge what they ought to be doing in their life. When you get your life set, and you are the example, the epitome of Christianity, then step out and make those kind of statements. Incidentally, when your life is the epitome of Christianity and you are the example of what all Christianity ought to be, you won't step out and do that kind of stuff because you'll understand it's not Christian. And if somebody else is involved in something that is not sin, whether you like it or not, I know some of us like to deer hunt. Others think, how dare you shoot poor little Bambi out there in the woods, you cold-hearted, mean thing. Well, I'd argue with you from Romans 14:1 myself, but nonetheless, there are things that are not sin that you just need to let go and focus on your own life and your own things and your own issues and your own problems and work on those interior things as opposed to trying to live a life for other people. Lying. Rather obvious. We're going to have to do a little tweaking on this one because the obvious, most of us get that. These 6 things the Lord hates, at 7 are an abomination to Him: a lying tongue, and then the heart that devises wicked plans, feet swift to running evil, the witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. That last one we'll put back in the gossip category for right now. All of us know that lying is wrong. We'll have that again in a minute in Ephesians 4:31. But what about speaking half the truth? Is that wrong? What if I don't outright lie to you, but I don't tell you everything I know you ought to know? You see, that's still deceit. And what we are trying to do as we reach those upper levels of discipline and discipleship is to be pure as God is pure, to be holy as He is holy. And God does not play games of deceit. And as Christians trying to imitate God, we don't play games of deceit either. One of my favorite little jokes, and I'm sorry ladies, I'm kind of picking on you, is the husband says to his wife, she has a new dress on. He says, oh, is that new? And she says, no, it's been in the closet a long time. She's thinking in her mind, about 8 hours, that's a long time. He's thinking a long time, that must be 2 or 3 months. I just hadn't noticed it, you know. He's thinking, I got off lucky for not noticing. And you see the little things that go on. And it's not just women that do that kind of stuff. Those kind of things, as we endeavor to be the Christians we ought to be, those are wrong. A whole other area here, respect that is due. This gets to be a tough area sometimes also, and not as obvious. When we talk to an older man, those of us who are younger, don't rebuke. We may have to exhort as a father. That means there are some things that need to be said sometimes. But there's a way I can talk to my dad, and there's a way I'd never talk to my dad. My dad's pushing 80, and I still wouldn't talk to him that way, even though I know I could outrun him now. I just wouldn't do it. Even the younger men, You talk to them as brothers, the women as mothers, and the younger as sisters. There's a respect that is due all of us as we deal with one another and try to encourage one another. And sometimes people run all over that respect and just stomp on people sometimes, and that's wrong, and that's sin. And I heard him say, well, if it's the truth, it's the truth. Well, yes, it is. And my Bible also said in Ephesians 5 and 15, speak the truth in love. Now, what are you going to do with that one? You see, this truth needs to be spoke. We don't need to water it down and backpedal and cover up the truth, but it's the attitude with which we bring forth the truth that God is interested in. And yes, there is a time to be more stern and to admonish and to be much clearer, and there's a time to be more gentle and tender, and that's going to be a judgment call. I wish I could give you some clear-cut rules on all of that where we could have it covered, but life doesn't work that simple. That's what makes this level of discipleship so tough. Dealing with your family. Children, obey your parents. Honor your father and your mother. When you talk to your parents, there's a certain respect due them. I don't care if you're 4 years old or you're 40 years old or if you happen to be 80 and your mom's 101, which incidentally, if I remember right, that's just about what happened with Brother O'Mary, wasn't it? His mother was 101 when she passed away, which meant Brother O'Mary would have been in his 70s at the time of her death. And he still gave her, to the best of my knowledge, the respect she deserved, even though he was the man of his age that he was. She still deserved that respect. That's the way it works. And if we lived in the pre-flood time and we were living to be 800 years old, we would still give them the respect they deserve, even though we were 742 and they were 896, or whatever the years would happen to be. You get the idea. We give that honor and that respect. As parents, this is a tough one sometimes. I love the Bill Cosby line, I brought you in, I can take you out. I think it's great humor. But it's not really Bible, is it? Bible says we raise them, we admonish them, we punish them, we beat them with a rod. They will not die. That's what the Proverbs said. But at the same time, we don't provoke them to wrath. There's a certain level there that even children have a line of respect that they deserve. And so in speech, it may not be that you're verbally abusing in the most profound, the most blatant of senses, but still, there's that level where that child must feel that nurturing, that discipline, the things that a child needs to grow. And the parent that misses that and professes to be a Christian has not learned to bring their mouth into the line of discipleship that it ought to be brought into. So you get into the whole family, and I didn't go into Ephesians 5 where we'd bring the husband and the wife into that, but you could bring that into it too, because the way the husband and wife talk to each other is also part of our Christianity. And we're not saying they can't tease and have a good time and rib one another, but we all know where we've crossed that line of good ribbing to where we're no longer having good fun and we're being mean. And that's not Christian. Now let's change a little bit, and this is about our next to the last one. I'm going to put this one in politics because the way it starts out in verse 1, subject to rulers, authorities, obey, ready for every good work, speak evil of no one. Now, no one means no one, but I'm going to use politics here because politics is American favorite pastime. And you have every right to sit down at Hardee's or McDonald's or wherever it is you sit. Those are the two places I sit. I really avoid the whole politics myself. But you have every right to discuss politics and whether you think this move or that move is right, whether you think we ought to still be over there and wherever those places are we're at, you've got a right to your opinion. If you think we ought to never have gone, you have a right to your opinion. And you have a right in America to express your opinion. But when you start dogging the politicians and saying what kind of dirty, rotten rats they are and demeaning their character and going beyond, look, I'm anti-abortion. I think that is the worst thing. That's just murder. And I think politicians that support abortion will stand accountable to God. But even Michael the archangel wouldn't bring a reviling accusation against the devil himself. So while I'm going to teach against abortion and I'm going to teach against homosexuality, where do you cross the line and start getting yourself in trouble when you start insulting the politicians? Just, it's kind of a tough area, isn't it? But that's one of the areas we work in. And so we stand our ground. We stand on that book, chapter, and verse foundation. And if it's a biblical issue, it makes it a little clearer. If it's one that's not so biblical, such as how should we deal with the people coming across our border illegally? I've got some pretty harsh ideas myself, but nonetheless, that's not really something I can read in the scriptures that address it. So the government has the right to do what it wants to do there. And you got your ideas. But you don't start giving the politician down the road and telling every dirty story on him you can think of, and probably half of them aren't true in politics anyway. You know how politics goes. So generally speaking, we got to be careful there. And I know my favorite joke about politicians is, you know how to tell that they're lying? Look, see if their lips are moving. Oh, I don't know. Is that the right thing to say or not? Well, can I say it about lawyers? You see, we get in the areas there that we've got to be careful. He said, speak evil of no one. Be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. As we talk about our mouth and being accountable for every word, this is the place we're trying to take our Christian discipleship, our development, as we keep pressing up that straight and narrow road. And this does make it straight and narrow, doesn't it? This makes it really tough. But we keep pressing on the upward way, because that's what we enlisted in the Lord's army to do, is press on. Our last point, this will really kind of tie in. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. If it doesn't edify, if it doesn't build up, let it go. What difference is it really going to make? I'll tell you, the value you can get from your speech, in my humble opinion, is that it really says more about what's inside of me than what it says about the people I'm talking about. I made reference to Mark chapter 7, verse 21 this morning, verse 21, 22. And one of the things in that verse is foolishness. He says, out of the heart comes foolishness. Well, how's that foolishness most often expressed? Probably most often expressed in the words that I say. And so one of the most valuable things about the whole speech thing is for me to learn to look at what I'm saying and then ask myself, why did I say that? Why did I need to say that? What did I think I was going to get out of that? What does that say about what's really deeper in my heart? What does that say about my pride or my arrogance or my expectations or my view of myself in the world? I mean, there's so many angles that you can look at it, but it takes me back to the only place I can do anything about, and that's my heart. I can't do anything about anybody else's heart. I can stand up here and encourage and admonish and yell and scream and talk soft and do everything in between. But the only heart I can do anything about is mine. And the only way I can do that is to look at what's coming out of it and understand that what's coming out of it is suggesting what's in there. And therein I can learn a whole lot about me. And if you can learn to look at your words and your thoughts and your speech habits, you can learn a whole lot about yourself too. And therein, the straight and narrow road gets really straight and narrow and quite tough. Two more verses, actually just one. We're going to end with Matthew 12 and 36, where we begin. It said, present your body a living sacrifice. Brethren, that doesn't mean just sitting on that pew. And I know that pew can get to feeling a little tough sometimes. That means our mouth also. That means our whole body. That means the things that we say, we present that a living sacrifice. That means if it's not going to glorify God, then as I continue to develop in that higher level of self-discipleship, self-discipline, even the very words that come out of my mouth, even in private, are going to be monitored for the glory of God. You see, if I'm driving down the road all by myself, which I do about 2 or 3 hours a week, does it really matter if anybody's in the car to hear me say what I say or not? Every idle word. You know, the only one that matters who really hears it is our Father above. And if He heard it, it counts. It doesn't matter if it's something Sharon and I whisper in secrets and nobody else hears. God heard. You see, get the idea? And so we bring everything in submission to God. We bring every thought into captivity. We present our body a living sacrifice. Even this most unruly member right here that bounces around so freely. We even endeavor to bring our tongue into sacrifice unto the living God and press on the upward way. We came in at Matthew 12:36. Let's end there. Every idle word that we speak we'll give an account of in the day of judgment. He goes on to say, by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned. Brethren, look carefully at your words and look in your heart as you look at those words that came out of your heart. I know this hasn't been a regular plan of salvation kind of sermon, but if you've not yet obeyed the gospel and you know that you need to, we're here to help any way we can. While together we stand and sing.